Welcome to a special episode of the Outright Proud podcast. We are marking Intersex Day of Remembrance for 2024 and taking stock of the significant strides made in the realm of intersex rights over the past year. My name is Matuba Mahlatjie, and I have with me my remarkable colleague, Kimberly Zieselman. She goes by she, her pronouns, and she's also Outright International Senior Advisor for Global Intersex Rights. And she's here to guide us into this crucial conversation. Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Matuba. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to be here talking about intersex human rights, particularly on Intersex Day of Remembrance or Intersex Day of Solidarity, as some people refer to it. I think that really speaks a lot to the need for strong allies to the intersex movement, including the LGBTQ plus broader movement and others. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Kim, this conversation, I'm looking forward so much to this conversation because it will also include the dispelling of common misconception about intersexuality and hopefully give us a greater understanding that will result in support for intersex people, because we don't see that visible enough, and we'll also explore the challenges of medicalization, the shame and the trauma associated with intersexuality, and discuss how these challenges, how we can these harmful practices, we can push back against them. And once again, thank you. And if you are joining us on this podcast, welcome. Stay tuned as we reflect on the progress and the setbacks and the path forward for intersex rights and representation in 2024. Kimberly, I'm just going to dive straight into my first question to you, and where we talk about the common misconceptions about intersexuality and how can we work to dispel these misconceptions to create a greater understanding and support for intersex individuals.
Well, I always like to start with a definition of intersex when I'm speaking to an audience. I find many people, even within the broader queer community, are still unclear about what intersex means. So intersex refers to a person born with one or more sex characteristics that don't match up with the typical binary notion of either a male or a female body. So that could be things like genitals, chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, hormone levels, and usually a combination of more than one of those. Um, Also, I think it's important to know that intersex people are not that rare. We just have been mostly invisible. And over the last few decades, people are starting to really speak out. Intersex children are growing up, feeling more empowered as time goes on, and speaking out and sharing their stories and speaking their truth. And so increasingly, there's more visibility around the intersex population, but it still is mostly unknown. But in reality, we are as common as green eyes or red hair at almost 2%. We're more common than the birth of identical twins, for example. And if you think about like the population of, let's say, Mexico or Japan, the entire population of either one of those countries equals how many intersex people there are in the world. So we are here and we exist, and visibility raising is really a key step in our movement right now.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive answer to this question. But Kimberly, there's also medicalization, and there's also shame and trauma that's associated with intersexuality. I wonder how we can challenge these harmful narratives and promote more affirming and inclusive spaces for intersex people within healthcare, whether it's education and society at large.
Yeah, so you mentioned one of, if not the biggest priority of the intersex movement, human rights movement, is ending these medically unnecessary, non-consensual, harmful medical practices that are particularly happening to infants and children. So we're talking about children, in many cases infants, before they can even say their first word. So they don't have the bodily autonomy to make a decision about their own body, and others, adults, often family members, parents, and doctors, are making these decisions on their behalf, and they are irreversible decisions. So for example, if a baby is born with genitalia that doesn't appear to look quite typical for female or typical for male. Very often across the globe, a decision is made by parents and a doctor, by parents under the, I should say, the influence, the strong influence of the medical community, to make a decision about basically their child's future and which gender they think they should live in, which sex they should be assigned, surgically assigned. Um, and often, they get it wrong. And even if they don't get it wrong and the child ends up identifying with that gender they presumed, the medicalization and the experience of surgeries and repeated exams in medical institutions, and the shame that you mentioned and the stigma that comes with that, really have long-term, everlasting, harmful impacts. So there's both physical and emotional negative impacts, and there are other issues that we'll probably talk about in the intersex community, but this medicalization and these irreversible surgeries is the primary issue for our movement across the globe. We need to not only educate, you asked how can we, right? How can we end these harmful practices? I mean, I've been doing this work for, I don't know, about 15 years or so, formally as an advocate. There are activists, intersex people like myself that have come before me that have been doing this work even longer. So probably since the early 90s, intersex people started speaking out about these harmful surgeries, and including trying to educate medical professionals about the experience and the harmful impacts. Yet, despite that, these harmful practices are still happening in medical institutions right here in the United States, where I am, as well as across the world. And so it's not just a matter of visibility raising and education, because people have been speaking out for quite a long time. Unfortunately, it also requires policy change and legal change. So going a legal route to either legislatively change, set a law that bans these surgeries, regulate medical practices. And there are different approaches that the movement is taking in different parts of the world to do this.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you've been doing this for 15 years, in activism. Before I really get to the question that I had put on our script, I just want to hear from you on, what's been the drive for you? What made you carry on and continue doing this work? Because I cannot imagine the difficulty that you experience, because I also remember, as working as a journalist, how I struggled to find credible information about intersex people, or that I can use to report thoughtfully about intersex people. But what has been the drive for you all these years when you're doing this work?
For me, my story is not incredibly unique, unfortunately. But I specifically found out about my intersex traits and my intersex status, the fact that I was an intersex person, um, very late in life. I was 40, and so I had had surgery as a child done to me back in the early 80s here in the United States. But both my parents and certainly me were lied to about the true nature of the surgery, which is really hard to believe. This was a Harvard teaching hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, here in the United States. But this was also before the internet, and it was a time when I think there were less resources for parents and for others to really kind of fact check and look things up. So, everybody really most people look up to doctors as almost godlike, right? And healers. And so there's this respect and this deference given to doctors. And that's what happened in my situation. It's happened in many, many people's situations, where their parents hear the advice of the doctor. In my case, it was, your daughter was born with partially formed female reproductive organs, and they will become cancerous if not removed immediately. So, of course, my parents hear the word cancer and they're like, let's take care of this now. So this false kind of sense of medical urgency is created. And again, my case is not unique. I've heard this same story from hundreds of others. And so there was this rush to surgery, and they removed what I now know I didn't know this until I was 40, getting my medical records, but I now know that they removed healthy internal testes, so gonads that were testes, not ovaries. And I actually, in my case, never had any female reproductive organs ever. So there was nothing partially formed to become cancerous. But this cancer narrative is a very common one, and it was a very common one, particularly in my generation. It's starting to change a little bit, which is really great to see. But in my case, I found out when I was 40 that I actually had XY chromosomes, and that the true nature of the surgeries I just described. And at that point in my life, I had already married my husband. We had adopted children. Of course, I knew I couldn't have children, but I was told this lie that it was like a cancer issue. We'd adopted my children. I had gone to law school, was living a life, interestingly, in healthcare policy advocacy, not even knowing that I was intersex. In fact, I was working at one of the premier children's hospitals in the United States in Boston as a director of government relations doing advocacy for the hospital while these surgeries were happening to other kids, right like above my office. And at that time, I didn't even know I was intersex. I didn't even know what the word was. So it's been a fascinating journey. When I found out, for me, it was a couple of years of just getting to know other people. The biggest thing I could do was find others that could relate and understand what I'd been through. I think that's true for so many of us in our communities. So finding others, mostly online and then in person. I connected with a support group here in the United States that holds a conference every year. And that was life-changing. Just meeting other people that got it, that had been through similar experiences. And it was also shocking to realize how common this is and how these medical practices that are irreversible have been done without truly informed consent, and how many of us were finding each other now with the internet and walking around feeling similar feelings of stigma, shame, and other mental health, and some physical, definitely some physical ramifications from these surgeries. And so for me personally, after a couple of years of kind of taking care of myself and connecting with the community, I decided that I wanted to do something about this and kind of combine my activism background with my personal story. And that's what keeps me motivated today, is I don't want this to happen to any other children in the future. It's really all about promoting bodily autonomy and decision making, and allowing a person to make a choice that's best for them when they can meaningfully participate in that decision and actually understand. So I'm not anti-surgery. I'm not anti, people having surgeries that will affirm themselves, but I am very much for consent and people making their own decisions. And that's really what this is about. So for me, I started working at, I ended up working at Interact. It was called Advocates for Informed Choice when I started. Ann Tamar Mattis is an attorney and a partner of an intersex person, and she started the organization right out of law school to try to change these medical practices with the law. That was her thinking back around 2005. And I was her first full-time hire. And we worked together for about a year, and then I became executive director so she could focus on impact litigation. We were trying to change it through litigation here in the United States. And I rebranded the organization to Interact, and I started lifting up the youth voices and really putting an impact and pointing towards their voices, their young voices, as the most impactful, I think. And did work with Interact, which is still working today in the largest policy organization in the United States, focused on intersex. And then I had an opportunity to go to the State Department and join Special Envoy Stern, who of course used to be the executive director of Outright, working as a subject matter expert to work on promoting and advancing intersex rights globally, so outside of the U.S., and have had a great experience connecting with other activists around the globe who are struggling in similar and different ways than we are here in the United States. There are a number of issues that are also unique to certain parts of the world, and additional issues besides the harmful surgeries. And then, of course, I was privileged to be able to join Outright about a year ago.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you trusting the rest of the world with your story. I mean, a lot of people are going to be watching this podcast, and I'm sure it's going to be a resource for many people and very lucky journalists who, unlike me, will have a resource like this one to, to tell story even more thoughtfully about intersex people. Now, let's talk about the how intersex people's rights and interests are aligned with the broader LGBTIQ movement. Because I've just been to a webinar here in South Africa. October is Pride Month here, and there've been so many questions about the I in LGBTIQ and how it fits into the broader movement. And I think you're the perfect person to give us that answer, Kimberly.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. And what I usually say is, first of all, I consider myself an ally. I have never considered myself part of the LGBTQ community formally as a queer person. But despite that, I very much believe that the intersex community and the I belongs as part of this broader umbrella because I believe we were born with queer bodies. I consider myself somebody who was born with a queer body. I personally identify as intersex. It's important to note that many people who meet the definition of intersex that I gave earlier, who have this medicalized experience, do not necessarily identify with the term. So that's another reason why we're not as visible, because a large portion of the population globally doesn't necessarily identify with that term. They may identify more with having a medical condition. So I often want to point to the lived experience, the medical experience, as the common denominator more than an identity. However, even though intersex isn't an identity, I believe it belongs within the broader queer umbrella because we as people, as a community, have experienced discrimination and harm based on other people's societies, others' fear. In our case, it's a fear of difference. In our case, it's fear of our bodies being different. So a perceived difference, right? And so I think homophobia, quite honestly, even though intersex is not a sexual orientation or even a gender identity, I think homophobia plays a lot into why these harmful practices are happening, why I think it has to do with the baggage that some medical providers and maybe parents have and their own prejudices around queer people and wanting to fix intersex children so they are not part of that queer community. I know this is absolutely a fact in many cases, and I think that's another reason why the intersex community really is aligned, and also why the LGBTQ plus community has been the first and quite honestly the only movement to reach out to the intersex community and bring them into the fold, not uniformly, not everywhere, but generally in many instances. And I think it's because of that as an aside, I'm going to add that many people who do hear intersex people speak, see them on TikTok, see them on Instagram, meet them in college, wherever. Often those intersex people are also queer, also have another identity. And I'm not sure 100% why that is, but I think it has something to do with being driven to speak out because of your queerness and your perceived difference in one way, and then you're also intersex. What I find challenging is that so much of our community, so many people that meet the definition of intersex in this world, even here in the United States, remain hidden and closeted because they can pass. They don't have to be outed, right? They don't have to show that, they're walking hand in hand with a same-sex partner or dressing a certain way that kind of gives away a gender expression. They can really kind of remain hidden and invisible. And unfortunately, that's a result of a lot of shame and stigma still. So yes, we belong in the broader LGBT plus community, and also that embracing of the intersex community really needs to come as meaningful, intentional inclusion. So just tacking on the I, even though well-intentioned by many, is not enough, and in fact can do more harm than good. So I really encourage other queer organizations, other queer activists who want to work with and include the intersex community to really get to know what the nuances of our issues are. One of the biggest ones being that the human rights violations that happen to so many of us can happen as early as minutes after birth. Okay, so this is happening as young children. We're not expressing anything yet. We don't have a sexual orientation yet. So I think that is one of the very unique differences that needs to be remembered. And a very dramatic kind of example of this is in some parts of the world, even today, if an intersex child is born with a visible difference, which is not always the case, only sometimes is it visible at birth. Often it comes out later during puberty or even adulthood. The sex characteristics and the differences become obvious due to not going through a typical puberty or whatever. But children that are born with visible differences in some parts of the world are killed. Infanticide is real, or abandoned, or not abandoned, not killed, but abused and bullied. So this is a real children's rights issue that and it also, I think, has intersections with the disability rights movement, the women's rights, the reproductive justice movement. Many of us, by the nature of our surgeries, have been sterilized. So this is a very cross-cutting movement. And again, I want to underscore the fact that the LGBTQ plus movement has been the first, and so far, quite honestly, again, the only movement to step up and work on this. But I do not believe that the LGBTQ plus movement, the intersex movement, can do this alone. So I'd like to make a call for other movements to step up and work with us, because like I said, this really is an intersectional issue and a very serious issue when we're talking about things like murdering children.
Yeah, thank you. Such interesting, fascinating, and really scary information that you're sharing with us. But I'm sure a lot of people had no idea about. I'm not even halfway through the questions I have, and we have so little time. But thank you so much again for making time to do this very important podcast. And in recent years, Kimberly, we've seen the coalescing of a global anti-gender movement that is attacking, the gains made by trans people, same-sex couples, and families, and women. How does the anti-gender movement impact intersex people?
It's a great question, and one that's very, very timely, as I think we see, particularly on social media and on the internet. We see so much hate and misinformation in general, very often about the queer community, or specifically there's a large anti-transgender movement, of course, and a lot of hate and misinformation online. And recently, I'd say in the past year or so, that's starting to extend to the intersex community. It's really the first time that I've noticed it, and I think in the past, to a large extent, the intersex community used to kind of fly under the radar because of the lack of visibility and the lack of understanding. So because of increased visibility and increased advocacy, one of the negatives that comes with that is the increased hate, right, from the haters, because the haters are going to hate. And I think for the intersex community, what I've witnessed, and I can just use an example here, I think, to make this more concrete, is the Paris Olympics, the Summer Olympics this past summer in Paris. I think many of the listeners will recall that there was a lot of media and a lot on social media as well around two different boxers, female boxers, that were being criticized for competing in women's boxing because they were being accused of being really men, or being accused of being trans or intersex. And there was a lot of talk about these boxers having, heightened hormone levels, or really having XY chromosomes. And to my knowledge, still none of this has been verified. But that kind of hate started through the Olympics, started triggering a lot of misinformation and conversation online, that for the first time in my 15, 17 years of doing this work, I started noticing online in my various different private Facebook groups and other social media platforms where intersex people converse in safe spaces. I started noticing a huge increase in the number of people feeling distraught, depressed, having high anxiety, and talking about this and being really triggered by this, because I don't think at a global level this had really happened before. We've had, of course, Caster Semenya in South Africa, and other females, always women of color, Olympic athletes, been accused of these kinds of things. But there was something about these boxers and this Olympic moment that felt really, really different. And I think it's fueled by the increasing anti-gender, anti-LGBT movement that we're seeing, that you alluded to in your question. It is affecting the intersex population. Also in smaller ways, in discourse I see on Twitter or X and other places, women actually getting really angry at intersex women, calling us, we're not really women, and how dare we call ourselves women. So, for example, I have XY chromosomes, and therefore I shouldn't call myself a woman. So it's very similar to the trans backlash, and we're starting to see that's also a conflation that's out there that we haven't talked about much. There's a huge conflation between intersex and trans, and of course some intersex people maybe have trans experience and identify as trans, but we're very, very different categories. But there's a lot of conflation, and I think the sad hate and prejudice against the trans community that's out there is starting to sweep in the intersex community a little bit in some instances. And so our community in different ways are feeling the negative impacts of that, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, with everything that you just said now, which is quite alarming, I'm pretty sure there are milestones, that we can reflect on, like the United Nations, adopting its first ever resolution specifically addressing discrimination, violence, and harmful practices against persons with innate variations in sex characteristics. And how has this resolution reshaped, the conversation around intersex rights, and what are the potential implications for the future? And I would actually like to know if, because I'm sure you more than I do, you follow media representation of intersex people in mainstream media, and if you've seen any changes or any movement towards the right direction in that sense, Kimberly.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So, first of all, you mentioned the United Nations resolution that passed this past April. That was a big milestone, and it came after really a full decade of activism by many, many different activists around the world, advocating at the UN. Over the last decade, we've had positive statements affirming our existence and claiming, that our human rights our human rights are being violated, have come from different UN bodies and whatnot. But there was something different about this resolution, to have the Human Rights Commission in Geneva actually vote with no votes. There were some abstentions from some member states, but there were no votes, which was significant. And to have a resolution passed so solidly that recognizes our community and the human rights violations, I'll be honest. I mean, I'm one of the activists pushing for this. As an activist, I thought, well, this resolution, what it actually does is it requires the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to research and gather data and do interviews and put out a call for information, which they have right now, and put together a comprehensive report on the status of the intersex community, and present it to the Human Rights Council, in September of 2025. So I first thought, okay, it's another report. Like, how many more reports do we need before we're going to be taken seriously as a community? Like, there's been so much qualitative data, so many stories, myself and hundreds of other people speaking about their stories and pointing to the harm. So I was excited about the milestone, but also internally a little skeptical. But that's changed a little bit recently. And the reason it's changed is because since that happened in April, I've been in a variety of different spaces and around different tables. And I have noticed a significant difference in people's attitudes towards the intersex issues and their kind of, how do you say, like, I think this resolution has given our issues and our movement political clout and credibility that we didn't have before, which is sad. We really, it shouldn't have taken, a resolution in Geneva, and we still have a long way to go. But I do think that, to your question, I think that has really raised the bar and raised some visibility, and it's being taken more seriously by member states, other NGOs. So, it's a slow journey to get there, but that milestone resolution, I think, has been a turning point, and there will probably be many more. So I do feel hope. I do feel like we're on a positive trajectory towards increasing visibility, but also engaging decision makers to actually try to make a change and make a difference for the intersex community. We've also had just other examples of hope. There have been a handful of countries that have passed national laws banning intersex surgeries on minors, and these laws are all a little different. Some of them have been criminalizing it, actually with penalties for doctors, and other laws have been civil laws. For example, in Kenya, they passed a law a couple of years ago by amending their Children's Rights Act. And so I think there are lots of creative ways that different activists working in collaboration with governments in different political and cultural environments can be flexible to create this change that will end up benefiting the intersex community. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we're going to see more approaches at the government level to do so. And another example is in Africa. Actually, the African Human Rights Commission, continent-wide, I'm not using the proper name, but the human rights body passed a resolution actually over a year ago, so before the UN did. And the language isn't perfect. Some of it's a bit pathologizing, and but it was groundbreaking to actually have this body in Africa recognize the intersex community as a community that was being harmed and needed to be protected. So I know there are activists in Africa now that are trying to use that as a tool for advocacy. So I think these things, even though they're statements, they're resolutions, or they call for a report, I've learned through experience that they actually do raise the bar and bring a lot of credibility to our issue. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see more progress.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, Kimberly, and that's all the time we have for this interesting outright podcast that I've been anticipating for so many days, because you and I have been going back and forth planning this and making sure that it happens. And I really appreciate your time. And for anybody that's watching at this point, please go to outrightinternational.org, where we have more beautiful storytelling on intersex people and some data-driven information that can be so helpful and useful for creating a better life for LGBTIQ people all over the world. Kimberly, once again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everybody else that's watching. And please go to outrightinternational.org for more information to get all the information that you need for to better the community and to share widely with everybody that needs to know about intersex people, because I know that there's very little information out there. Thank you so much.